the commissioner who's most responsible for energy security in Europe sign on to South Stream. It boggles the mind in my case. I hope that with the changes that are taking place this fall, that you'll have an EU that'll focus more on both long-term and short-term issues. Energy efficiencies, short-term issues like maybe LNG imports, which can be done much faster. But I think that a lot needs to be done on the question of they need more support by these energy islands in Central Europe. The Baltic states, Hungary, Bulgaria to some extent, and Poland need to be given more help by the European Union in order to get through this transition phase where you have other pipelines and increased LNG shipments. And I think that's very, very important because if you're talking about 2014, 2015, what do you do in between? And Russia, meanwhile, is taking steps to try to gobble up some of the most effective companies in Central Europe. MOL, the Hungarian oil and gas company, is under enormous pressure from Russian companies and the Russian government. MOL needs to have more support from the European Commission in maintaining its Europeanness and rather than being taken over by Surgutneftegas, which is very close to the Kremlin. These are the kinds of things that I think need to be done, and quickly.
Thank you. We have our first question, finally, from the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation. The question is, what pressure can the U.S. apply on Russia to help countries like Ukraine in their energy security? Can the U.S. play a role? Is it a player in this European game, basically, and such relations?
I suspect Roman could answer that better than any of us, but I'll just take a quick shot at it. I think the U.S. can play a role, particularly with presidential elections coming up. But part of the U.S. effort, we've tried to convince the Ukrainian authorities, governments from Yushchenko, Tymoshenko, and Yanukovych to reform their energy systems, and up to the present, that hasn't worked. Now, maybe the European Union and the U.S., now that Ukraine is facing a crisis, they may well reform their own system. Ukraine should be a country which would be at least 50% self-sufficient in energy within a 5-year period if they just adopted very large-scale energy efficiency techniques, moved quickly on coal bed methane projects, and improve the transit systems within the country. They could be very they could be energy effective and be 50% energy self-sufficient within 5 years, and they need to take those steps quickly. As far as Russia, the more Ukraine moves on internal reform, the easier it is for Ukraine and the United States to kind of push back a little with the Russians and the Russian efforts to dominate the situation both economically and politically within Ukraine.
If two-finger, I think that a comprehensive strategy from this new administration here in Washington for the Black Sea-Caspian region is one that would benefit Ukrainian interests the most. And that means not only a reset with Moscow, but a strategy which enhances the relationships with the capitals of the Black Sea-Caspian region. There are, yes, significant interests outside of the energy arena to speaking more and cooperating more with Moscow. That said, it goes without saying that the Western-oriented democratizing countries of the Black Sea-Caspian region not only must not be left in a lurch, but must be seen as strategically important for U.S. interests. So it's not necessarily that the United States is doing this out of goodwill, but rather for its own interests and for the security of the European continent in mitigating significant threats, energy and otherwise, in the Black Sea Caspian region, and allowing for greater independence, thus, for European allies within the European Union. Energy in this instance for Ukraine is intimately tied to European Union membership, and thus intimately tied to the European Union's Eastern Partnership. Given that the United States does not yet have a comprehensive strategy for the Black Sea Caspian region, and there are a number of other priorities on the desk of the White House, for the interim, and certainly in the election period in Ukraine, what can be best done from Washington's side is to put full support in fleshing out the Eastern Partnership, the European Union's Eastern Partnership, and particularly the energy angle of that. And that is not only technical and financial support for energy sector reform within Ukraine, it is far more broad. It is putting Ukraine in a number of functional ways, not just rhetoric, but functional ways. In fact, I would say that we need less rhetoric and more functional links in this case. We're putting Ukraine, helping to put Ukraine firmly on the path towards European Union membership.
Thank you. Just to remind you that a number of years ago, Romano Prodi, when he was the head of the Commission, said that the Palestinian autonomy will join the EU sooner than Ukraine will. So I think we should see what is happening in Brussels. Part of the question is how much oil and gas does the United States receive from Russia? Gas, practically none, negligible. There was a LNG shipment a number of years ago to the U.S. It was called Russian gas, Russian LNG. Well, it wasn't. It was actually Algerian LNG, which was gotten on a swap. Russians would sell their gas to Algeria. Algeria would sell its LNG further on, and we would bake our bread with it, or whatever. Yeah, this is the way it worked. But that was significant because a number of years ago, Gazprom announced that it wanted to control up to 20% of the U.S. LNG market. Now, the LNG market in the United States right now is about 1%. So they wanted to control 20% of 1%. Which is not very much, to be honest with you. But LNG is growing in Europe. Poland, for example, recently signed a deal with Qatar to import LNG. But first they have to build the import terminal. Now, I'd like to ask you about this. How do you see the role of LNG as one of the future alternatives to Russian pipeline-based gas? Do you think the Europeans are beginning to understand that? Do the East Europeans and the Central Europeans see this as an alternative? I read recently that Bulgaria has been speaking to Qatar about constructing an LNG liquefaction terminal on the Black Sea. I'd love to hear your views on it.
I'll just say a few things. First of all, the Russians had high hopes to bring Sakhalin gas into the west coast of the United States. And what's happened is, yes, they brought a shipment into Baja California, which was then put into the pipelines which came up to California. But this was all symbolic because we no longer need imported gas. The United States, in fact, if gas prices come back, we're going to have a surplus of gas because of new technologies and the tight gas technology, particularly in the western part of the United States. So we don't need Russian gas. And I think that increasingly, very quietly, a lot of firms, including American firms, are looking at tight gas fields in Western Europe and in Central Europe. And it may be that, in fact, the market for Russian gas in Europe will not climb to the area that a lot of people had feared earlier on.